The hiker in the woods. I always loved hiking alone. There was something calming about the stillness of the forest, the rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt, and the cool mountain air. I didn't need to think about anything except the next step, the next trail marker, and making it back before dark. At least, that's how it used to be. Last fall, I decided to challenge myself with a multi-day trek through a remote part of the national forest, a place far from the crowded campgrounds and weekend tourists. It wasn't the first time I'd ventured off the beaten path, but something about this particular trip felt different. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen another person in 2 days, or maybe it was the unsettling silence that had descended upon the forest as soon as I crossed into the deeper wilderness. On the third night, after a long day of hiking, I set up camp by a small creek. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the gentle trickle of water nearby. I built a small fire, ate dinner, and watched the stars slowly blink into existence overhead. Everything was peaceful. But then, just as I was about to crawl into my tent, I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the flickering firelight. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other animal, but it was standing too still. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was a man. He was just standing there, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No response. The figure didn't move. My heart began to race as I fumbled for the flashlight. When I clicked it on and aimed the beam toward him, the light illuminated an empty space. There was no one there. I scanned the tree line, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the shadows. After all, I'd been out here alone for days, and isolation can mess with your mind. I threw more wood on the fire and sat there for hours, staring into the darkness, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves putting me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I crawled into my tent, clutching my knife under the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep well. When I woke up the next morning, something was off. The fire had burned out, which was normal, but my gear, my pack, my boots, everything had been moved. Not far, but just enough to make me notice. My sleeping bag was unzipped, my water bottle tipped over, and my map, the one I kept carefully folded in my front pocket, was now lying unfolded on the ground. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. I packed up quickly, trying to shake off the growing unease gnawing at me. I didn't see any tracks, but I knew what I had seen the night before, and now, whoever, or whatever, it was had been close enough to touch my things. Close enough to touch me. As I started hiking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd stop, listening to the unnatural stillness of the woods. There were no birds, no wind, no life. Just that oppressive silence. I picked up the pace, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was out there. The trail was overgrown and twisted, and the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was lost. My map wasn't helping. The landmarks didn't match what I was seeing around me, as if the terrain itself had changed overnight. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. I stood still, listening. Nothing. I took a deep breath and kept walking, my legs shaky and my heart pounding. A few minutes later, the sound came again, this time closer. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what was following me. All I could do was walk faster, praying I'd stumble upon a familiar landmark, a ranger station, anything. But the footsteps kept following, faster and faster, until they were almost matching my own. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw it again. That same figure from the night before, standing ahead of me, motionless in the center of the trail. It was closer now, and I could make out more details. A dirty, tattered coat, long, matted hair, and eyes that seemed to reflect the last dying light of the day. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, blocking the trail. I took a step back. The figure took a step forward. Another step back. Another step forward. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I knew I had to do something. Fight or run. I tightened my grip on my knife and bolted off the trail, crashing through the underbrush, branches scratching at my face and arms. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest, until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I finally stopped, collapsing against a tree, gasping for air. For a moment, there was only the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, in the distance, I heard it. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps. Closer, closer. I wasn't alone in these woods anymore. And I don't think I ever will be again. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 2. I stayed there, pressed against the tree, hoping my breath wouldn't give me away. The footsteps were slow now, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, it was knew exactly where I was but wanted to drag this out. Wanted me to feel the fear. I gripped my knife tighter, my hand trembling. My mind raced through all the possibilities. Another hiker. A sick, twisted camper. But the figure. I couldn't shake the image. Something about it wasn't right. Human but not. The footsteps stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in place. The forest was still again, that unnatural, oppressive silence settling in like a thick fog. My ears strained, trying to pick up the faintest sound, anything that could tell me where it was. But there was nothing. Nothing but the dark and the dense trees around me. Slowly, I got to my feet. I knew I couldn't stay there. Whatever it was hunting me. I started walking, moving as quietly as I could, trying to stay out of sight. Every crack of a twig or rustle of a leaf sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I felt like a prey animal, running from a predator I couldn't see but could feel stalking me, watching me. I don't know how long I wandered like that. Hours, maybe. My legs were screaming in pain, my mouth dry, my body begging for rest. But I couldn't stop. Not after what I saw. Not with those footsteps following me, always just far enough to remind me I wasn't alone. As night fully took hold, the temperature dropped. The darkness felt heavy, suffocating. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and even with my flashlight, the beam seemed weak, as if the darkness was swallowing it whole. Then, just when I thought the footsteps had finally faded, I heard something new. Whispering. Soft, low, unintelligible. It was coming from the trees, from the shadows, but it didn't sound like just one voice. It was many, overlapping, like a chorus of low moans, growing louder with each passing second. Panic surged through me. I turned, shining my light around, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. Yet the whispers continued, louder and louder, filling my head. They seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, wrapping around me like a thick blanket of dread. I stumbled forward, my legs moving on instinct, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away, but the forest twisted and turned, every path looking the same. It felt like I was running in circles, always ending up where I started. That's when I saw it. Ahead of me, through a gap in the trees, there was a light. Faint, flickering. A campfire, maybe? Another hiker? Someone who could help? My heart leaped in my chest as I hurried toward it, the whispers growing fainter behind me. I broke through the tree line and found myself in a small clearing, and there, by the fire, was a tent. I called out, my voice shaking. "Hello? Anyone there?" No answer. I edged closer to the fire, desperate for the warmth and the company of another person. But as I approached the tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. It was my tent. The same one I had set up the night before, the same fire pit I had built. My gear was there, scattered around the camp, just as I had left it. But this wasn't possible. I had run for miles, deeper into the forest. How was I back here? I stood frozen, staring at the scene, my mind struggling to make sense of it. That's when I felt it. A presence. I turned slowly, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. It was closer now. I could see its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale, stretched tight over a gaunt, hollow skull. Its eyes were deep, sunken pits, black and lifeless, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. Its lips were cracked and pulled back into a twisted grin, revealing rows of yellowed teeth. It took a step forward, and the whispers returned, louder now, filling my head with an unbearable noise. My body locked in place, paralyzed by the sight of it. The figure raised a bony hand, pointing directly at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then it spoke, its voice a raspy, guttural whisper that cut through the air like a knife. "You shouldn't have come here." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of my lungs. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure took another step, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just moving toward me, it was gliding, hovering just above the ground like a shadow detached from its source. In sheer desperation, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping against my face and arms. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent. I didn't know where I was going. Just away. I couldn't stop. I couldn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded again, but I knew it was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move. The sun began to rise, casting a pale, sickly light through the trees. I forced myself to stand, my entire body trembling. I needed to find a way out of the forest. But as I looked around, something horrible dawned on me. The forest, it had changed. The trail was gone. The landmarks I had been using to guide myself had vanished. It was as if the forest itself had shifted overnight, trapping me in its maze of trees and shadows. I'm still here, wandering, searching for a way out. But every time I think I've found the path, I end up back at that clearing, back at my camp, back where it all began. And every time I return, the figure is a little closer, a little more real. I don't think it's going to let me leave. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 3. I don't know how many days have passed. Time feels meaningless here, swallowed by the endless tangle of trees and the ever-present whispers in the dark. My body aches, my legs are raw from the constant walking, and my throat burns with thirst, but it's the creeping madness that terrifies me the most. I'm not sure how much longer I can hold on to myself. The figure, the thing that stalks me, never fully reveals itself, not in daylight anyway. But at night, it's different. The fire doesn't help. No matter how high I build it, the darkness presses in, smothering the light. And that's when I hear it again. The whispers. I started recognizing patterns in the murmurs. Sometimes I think I hear my name, drawn out and distorted, as if being spoken by something that doesn't fully understand the human tongue. Other times it's different. Words I don't understand. Ancient guttural sounds, like the forest itself is trying to speak through the creature. And then, last night, I heard something new. Not just whispers, but footsteps. The slow, steady crunch of leaves behind me, the soft rustling of something moving through the brush. It circled my camp. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Watching. Waiting. I didn't sleep. How could I? Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, expecting the figure to step into view at any moment. But it never did. It didn't need to. It was toying with me. At some point, I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the fire had burned to ash, and the morning fog had rolled in, thick and suffocating. I sat up slowly, every muscle screaming in protest, and that's when I saw it. My knife, the one I had been clutching when I fell asleep, was gone. I scrambled to my feet, frantically searching the camp, but there was no sign of it. And then, I noticed something else. Footprints. They weren't mine. They circled the camp, close to where I had been lying, and then led off into the trees. Whatever had been watching me last night had come closer than ever before, close enough to take my knife, close enough to kill me if it had wanted to. I don't know why it didn't. The realization hit me like a cold wave. It wasn't trying to kill me, not yet. It was drawing this out, savoring my fear, feeding on it. The more terrified I became, the stronger it seemed. But something else was happening too. The forest itself was changing around me, warping into something darker, more twisted. The trees seemed taller, their branches gnarled and claw-like, blocking out the sun even at midday. The ground felt rump beneath my feet, soft and spongy, like it wasn't solid anymore. The air was thick with decay, the scent of rotting wood and damp earth filling my lungs. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to keep moving, keep searching for a way out. But the forest didn't want to let me go. I started walking, following no real path, just trying to stay away from that clearing from my tent. It was a maze now, the trees closing in on all sides, and no matter how far I went, I could feel the thing watching me. Every time I stopped to catch my breath, I would hear it again, the footsteps, soft at first, then growing louder as it drew nearer. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. But I had to keep moving. I had to try. By late afternoon, the fog had thickened, turning the forest into an endless grey blur. My head was pounding, my body screaming, or maybe I could barricade myself inside and wait it out. Anything was better than staying out in the open. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy with exhaustion, and pushed the door open. The cabin was small, dusty, and smelled of mildew, but it was a roof over my head. I closed the door behind me and slumped against it, feeling a small flicker of hope for the first time in days. The interior was simple. A rickety table, a couple of broken chairs, and a fireplace long cold and filled with cobwebs. There was a narrow cot in the corner, sagging under its own weight. I checked every corner, every shadow, making sure I was alone. For now, I was. I lit a small fire in the hearth, just enough to warm the room, and sat there, my back against the wall, clutching a broken piece of wood I had found on the floor as my only weapon. I knew it wouldn't be enough, but it was all I had left. Night fell quickly. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable. I listened intently, waiting for the footsteps, the whispers, anything that would signal the figure's return. But there was nothing. Just silence. Maybe the cabin had thrown it off. Maybe, for the first time, I had outsmarted it. But as the fire began to die, the cabin's temperature dropped. My breath hung in the air, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A faint, wet scraping sound. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned slowly toward the noise. The shadows in the corner seemed darker, deeper, as if they were moving, shifting. I stood up, the piece of wood gripped tightly in my hand, and took a step toward the corner. The scraping stopped. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke, soft, barely above a whisper, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." It was the same voice, the same raspy, inhuman voice that had spoken to me in the woods. And it was inside the cabin. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, my eyes locked on the corner. The shadows seemed to pulse, growing darker, thicker, and then, out of the darkness, it stepped forward. The figure. It was no longer standing at the edge of the clearing. It was here, with me, inside the cabin. Its hollow eyes stared at me, and that twisted grin stretched across its face, wider now, revealing more of those yellow, rotting teeth. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. It took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to follow it, crawling along the floor, the walls, consuming everything in their path. I stumbled back, tripping over the broken chairs, my mind racing with one desperate thought. I had to get out. But as I turned to flee, I realized with horror that the door was gone. The windows, too. The cabin had changed, just like the forest. I was trapped. And the figure was getting closer. Its mouth opened, wider than any human mouth should, and from the black pit inside, the whispers poured out, filling the room, filling my head. They were louder now, deafening, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. "You're mine now," it hissed. I fell to the floor, my vision swimming, my body shaking. The shadows swallowed the light, and the last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the figure, looming over me, its grin wider than ever. And then, there was nothing. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 4. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the cabin. I was lying on the cold, damp forest floor, my body stiff and aching. The fog had lifted slightly, but the sky overhead was a dull, sickly gray, casting an eerie half-light over the landscape. I sat up, confused and disoriented. My clothes were torn and filthy, my skin caked in mud, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Nothing but the pounding of my heart and the shallow rasp of my own breath. It was as if the world itself had died while I was unconscious. For a long time, I just sat there, too terrified to move, trying to piece together what had happened. The cabin. The figure. It had cornered me, consumed me in its darkness. I had felt its icy presence seep into my skin, pulling me into oblivion. But somehow I was still here, still alive. Why hadn't it killed me? Why had it let me wake up? Slowly, I got to my feet, every joint in my body screaming in protest. I looked around, but there were no signs of the cabin, no signs of any trail or landmarks. Just the endless expanse of trees, stretching out in every direction, their trunks warped and twisted like bones half buried in the earth. I wasn't just lost anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere wrong. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going. There was no point of reference, no trail, no signs of life. It was like the forest had swallowed me whole, trapping me in its bowels. The whispers came back as I walked, faint at first, but always growing louder, always pulling at the edges of my mind, making it harder to think. I had learned not to listen to them, but it was getting harder to resist. They were inside me now, burrowing deeper, twisting my thoughts, my memories. Sometimes I heard voices I recognized, my own voice, the voice of friends, family, but warped, distorted into something monstrous. Other times, it was that same cold, raspy whisper, reminding me that I didn't belong here, that I would never leave. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time didn't feel real anymore. I walked through the endless maze of trees, my vision blurring, my legs numb. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything in what felt like forever, but the hunger and thirst had faded, replaced by a deeper, more primal fear, the fear of losing myself. At some point, I stopped. I had to. My body couldn't go any farther. I collapsed against a tree, my hands trembling, my mind racing with fragments of thoughts that made no sense. I was losing it, losing the last threads of my sanity. That's when I heard it. Not the whispers, not the footsteps, but something else. A voice. A human voice. Help! Is anyone there? It was distant, muffled by the trees, but unmistakable. Someone else was out here. Someone alive. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the dizziness that threatened to send me crashing back down. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse and raw. "Over here." There was no response. I stood there, straining my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but the forest was silent again. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just another trick of the whispers, another way to drive me deeper into madness. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. Closer. Please, someone. Without thinking, I started running toward the sound. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. There was someone else out there, someone who might know the way out, someone who could save me from this nightmare. I ran faster, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was getting closer now, just beyond the next line of trees. I pushed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I saw him. A man, standing in a small clearing, his back to me. He was wearing a dirty, torn hiking jacket, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't moving. "Hey!" I shouted again, relief flooding through me. "Hey! I'm here. The words died in my throat. He turned around slowly, and I saw his face. It was the figure. Not the shadowy, monstrous thing I had seen before, but human. A man pale and gaunt, with hollow, sunken eyes that stared right through me. His lips were cracked, pulled into that same twisted grin I had seen in the darkness. But now, in the dull daylight, it looked worse, too wide, too unnatural, like his face had been stretched and warped into something inhuman. My legs went numb. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. He took a step forward, his head tilting to the side in a way that no human neck should bend. "You came back," he whispered, his voice the same raspy, guttural sound that had haunted me for days. "You were always going to come back." I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure took another step, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes never left mine. I turned to run, but the trees were closing in again, their branches tangling together, forming a wall of wood and shadow. There was no way out. The figure's voice grew louder, more insistent, the the words seeping into my mind like poison. "You're not lost. You never were." I spun around, ready to fight, ready to do anything to escape, but when I turned, the figure was right there, inches from me, his cold, dead eyes staring into mine. His breath was rancid, like rotting flesh, and his hand, cold, bony, impossibly strong, reached out and touched my face. "You were mine the moment you set foot in these woods," he hissed. The touch burned, freezing my skin, sending waves of agony through my body. I screamed, falling to the ground, clutching my head as the whispers filled my mind, louder and louder, drowning out my thoughts. Everything went dark. When I woke again, I was still in the forest. But something was different. The air felt heavier, colder. The trees seemed darker, more twisted than before, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. My body felt wrong. My skin was pale, almost translucent, my limbs stiff and unresponsive. I looked down at my hands, thin, bony. I stood up, feeling the shadows move around me, feeling the whispers return, louder now, more eager. They were coming for him. And so was I. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 5. I stood there, frozen, as the realization washed over me like a cold, crushing wave. I wasn't the hunted anymore. I was the hunter. The figure, the thing that had stalked me, toyed with me, consumed me, was gone. But its presence lingered in the air, in the whispers that now hummed softly in the back of my mind. The forest, too, felt different. It no longer twisted and walked to trap me. It responded to me like it was part of me now, or maybe I was part of it. I flexed my fingers, watching as my pale, bony hands moved in slow, jerky motions. They didn't feel like mine. Nothing felt like mine anymore. Not my skin, not my breath, not even my thoughts. I could still remember who I was, but it was slipping away like a dream fading in the light of day. And yet, there was something else. A hunger. A pull. It was subtle at first, but as I stood there, listening to the distant sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, it grew stronger. My body itched to move, to follow, to hunt. I tried to resist. I tried to hold on to the last thread of humanity I had left, but the whispers were too strong. They urged me forward, promising release, promising to end the torment if I just let go, if I just gave in. And then I saw him. A lone hiker, moving slowly through the trees, oblivious to the horror lurking in the shadows. He was young, maybe in his 20s, with a heavy backpack slung over his shoulders. His face was drawn, tired, like he'd been lost in the forest for days. His eyes scanned the trees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had no idea I was watching. The hunger flared up again, sharper this time, almost painful. I took a step forward without thinking, my body moving of its own accord. The forest shifted around me, the trees parting just enough to let me through, then closing back in, concealing me from his view. The whispers grew louder. He's alone. He's scared. I moved closer, my footsteps silent on the forest floor. The hiker didn't hear me. He was too focused on the path ahead, on trying to find his way out. I could see the panic in his movements, the way his head darted from side to side, as if he knew something was watching him, but couldn't figure out where it was. He's ours now. The hunger gnawed at me, more insistent with every step. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I was no longer in control. The forest had claimed me, just like it had claimed so many before me. And now, it was using me to claim another. I was almost close enough to touch him now. Close enough to hear his frantic breathing, to see the sweat glistening on his brow. My fingers twitched, itching to reach out, to grab hold of him, to take what the forest wanted. But then something strange happened. The hiker stopped. He stood perfectly still, his body tense, his eyes wide with fear. He knew I was there. Somehow, he could feel me. My heart, or whatever was left of it, skipped a beat. I froze, waiting for him to move, waiting for him to run. But he didn't. Instead, he spoke. "I know you're there," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the trees. "I've heard the stories." The stories? How could he know? How could anyone know? For a moment, I hesitated. The hunger faltered, replaced by a strange sense of curiosity. Who was this man? How did he know about me, about the forest? I know what you are, he continued, his voice shaking. You're like them now, aren't you? Them. The others. The ones who had been lost to the forest before me. The ones who had become part of it. Was that what I had become? Was I just another victim, another piece of the forest's endless hunger? The whispers in my head grew more frantic, urging me to strike, to take him before it was too late. But something held me back, something about the way he spoke, the way he stood there, unflinching in the face of the terror that surrounded him. I'm not afraid of you, he said, though his voice betrayed his fear. I've been looking for you. My mind reeled. Looking for me. Why? How could anyone willingly seek out the horrors of this place? The hiker took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes scanning the trees. I know what happened to you. I know about the others. And I know there's a way out. A way out. The words hit me like a bolt of lightning, cutting through the fog of hunger and whispers that had clouded my mind. Could it be true? Could there really be a way to escape this nightmare, to break free from the forest's grip? But the whispers fought back, louder now, more vicious. They didn't want me to listen. They wanted me to take him, to feed the forest, to continue the cycle. I could feel the forest pulling at me, trying to drag me back into its darkness. But I could also feel something else, something deep inside me that wanted to believe the hiker's words, that wanted to escape. The hiker was closer now, close enough that I could see the determination in his eyes, the way his hands trembled, but didn't falter. You don't have to do this, he said softly. You can still get out. You just have to fight it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to fight. But the whispers were too strong, the hunger too overwhelming. I could feel it taking over again, my body moving toward him, my fingers reaching out, ready to do what the forest demanded. And then, in one final act of desperation, the hiker did something I never expected. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, weathered journal. He opened it to a page filled with strange, scribbled symbols, and as he began to read aloud, the air around us seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but the words he spoke cut through them like a blade. The trees trembled, their branches quivering in response to whatever ancient power the hiker was invoking. I could feel the pull of the forest weakening, the grip it had on me loosening with every word he spoke. The hunger faded, replaced by a burning sensation, like fire coursing through my veins. I doubled over, gasping, as the whispers turned into a deafening roar, trying to drown out the hiker's voice. But he didn't stop. You don't belong here, he shouted, his voice rising over the chaos. You were never meant to be part of this. I felt the ground shift beneath me, the trees bending and twisting as the forest itself seemed to scream in rage. The darkness that had enveloped me for so long began to peel away, like a shroud being lifted. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The forest was still, the whispers gone. The trees around me looked normal again, their branches no longer twisted and gnarled. The sky was clear, the dull gray replaced by the soft glow of dawn breaking through the canopy. I looked up at the hiker, who was standing over me, breathing heavily, the journal still clutched in his hands. His eyes were filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. You're free, he said quietly. It's over. But as I lay there, staring up at him, I couldn't help but wonder if it really was over. Because somewhere, deep in the back of my mind, I could still hear the faintest of whispers. Waiting. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 6. The faint whisper gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, like a far-off hum you couldn't quite hear but could always feel. It was a subtle, insidious thing, lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts, a reminder that even if the forest had released its grip on me, it hadn't truly let me go. Not completely. The hiker knelt beside me, his breath still ragged from whatever ritual he had just performed. His face was pale, the weight of what he had done etched into the lines on his brow. He looked at me with tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much. You okay? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake the forest's hunger again. I nodded, though the tremble in my hands betrayed the truth. I wasn't okay, not yet, but I was alive, and that felt like a victory, even if it was a hollow one. He helped me to my feet, and as I stood, I felt the weight of the forest's gaze on my back. It was still watching, still waiting, like a predator biding its time. I could feel it in the air, in the way the leaves barely stirred, the way the trees loomed just a little too close. The hiker seemed to sense it too. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're not safe here." I didn't argue. My legs were unsteady, and every step felt like walking through thick mud, but I followed him through the trees, away from the clearing where the darkness had nearly consumed me. The path ahead wasn't clear, but the hiker moved with purpose, like he knew where he was going. As we walked, I tried to shake off the feeling that something was still wrong. The forest was quieter now, the oppressive presence that had clung to me for so long seemed to have lifted. But there was an emptiness in its place, a hollow void that echoed with the memory of the whispers. The deeper we went, the more that emptiness gnawed at me. "How do you know all this?" I finally asked, my voice breaking the uneasy silence between us. The hiker glanced at me but kept walking. "I've been here before." His words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean? How many times?" He hesitated, as if deciding whether to tell me the whole truth. "This is my second time," he said at last. "But I didn't make it out the first time." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? You were dead?" "Maybe." His tone was matter-of-fact, but the weight of the statement pressed down on me. "I was lost, just like you. But I got out, sort of." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Sort of." "I came back for you," he said, looking ahead, "because I knew the forest wasn't done with you. You survived, but it was holding on to a piece of you. A piece it wasn't going to let go." I shuddered. "What piece?" He looked at me then, his eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Pity, maybe. The part of you that still hears the whispers." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew what he meant. The faint, almost imperceptible sound I had been trying to ignore since we left the clearing. The lingering whisper that tugged at the edges of my mind like an echo that wouldn't die. "It's still in you," the hiker continued, his voice soft but unyielding. "The forest. It's marked you. You might have walked away, but it's not done with you." My mouth went dry. "So, what does that mean? Am I like you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression somber. "No, you're not like me, not yet. But if we don't finish this, you will be." I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest. "What do you mean, finish this?" The hiker reached into his jacket and pulled out the journal again, the one filled with the strange symbols and scribbled notes. "There's one last thing we have to do," he said, flipping to a page near the back. "The forest doesn't let go easily. If you want to be free, for real this time, we have to sever the connection." He held up the journal, showing me the page. The symbols looked more intricate here, darker, like they had been burned into the paper. My stomach churned just looking at them. "What kind of connection?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The hiker's gaze was steady, unwavering. "The one between you and the figure." My heart raced at the mention of the figure. The thing that had stalked me, that had nearly consumed me in the cabin. I had thought it was gone, banished when the hiker performed the ritual, but now I wasn't so sure. "The figure," I whispered, dread seeping into my bones. "It's still out there, isn't it?" The hiker nodded slowly. "It's always out there. It's part of the forest. And it won't stop until it gets what it wants." "What does it want?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. "You," the hiker said simply. "It wants you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The figure wasn't gone. It had just been waiting, watching, biding its time. And now it knew I was still here, still vulnerable. The hiker turned back to the path, his voice grim. "We need to find the heart of the forest. That's where it's strongest. That's where we end this." I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sand. "And if we don't?" He didn't answer right away, but his silence was answer enough. If we didn't end it, the forest would take me. Just like it had almost done before. And this time, there would be no escape. We walked in silence after that. the trees around us growing darker, more twisted as we ventured deeper into the heart of the forest. The air felt heavier, the whispers louder, more insistent. The further we went, the more I could feel it, the presence, the pull, the thing waiting for me in the shadows. And then, after what felt like hours, we reached it. The heart of the forest. It was a clearing, much like the one where I had first encountered the figure. But this one was different. The trees around it were ancient, gnarled and blackened, their bark twisted into grotesque shapes. The ground was bare, the earth cracked and dry as if nothing had lived there in centuries. And in the center of the clearing, standing tall and silent, was the figure. Waiting. It was still humanoid, still shadowy and formless, but this time there was no mistaking its hunger. Its twisted grin was wider now, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. The air around it crackled with energy, like the forest itself was feeding off its presence. The hiker stood beside me, his grip on the journal tight. "This is it," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We end it here." I nodded, though my heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the figure's gaze on me, its hunger radiating through the clearing. It wanted me. It had always wanted me. The hiker opened the journal, his eyes scanning the page as he began to speak the words written there. The symbols seemed to glow as he spoke, the air around us growing thicker, heavier. The ground trembled, the trees groaning in protest as the ritual began. The figure's grin faltered. But then it moved. It was fast, faster than I could have imagined. One moment it was standing still, the next it was rushing toward us, a blur of shadow and malice. The hiker shouted something, his voice drowned out by the... All I could see was the figure. All I could feel was its cold, suffocating presence, wrapping around me like a shroud. And then everything went dark. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 7. The darkness swallowed me whole. It was suffocating, cold, and absolute. No light, no sound, just the crushing weight of nothingness pressing down on me. I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed, if I was standing or falling. All I knew was that the figure was here, with me, somewhere in the endless void. A sharp whisper cut through the silence. Mine. The voice was everywhere and nowhere all at once, echoing in my skull. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was closing in, its icy fingers wrapping around my mind, pulling me deeper into the abyss. But then, through the crushing blackness, I heard another sound, a voice, distant but familiar. The hiker. He was still there, still fighting. His words were faint, like they were coming from a great distance, but they cut through the figure's whispers. "Fight it," he called, his voice strained. "You have to fight it." I struggled to focus, to hold on to the sound of his voice. The figure's presence was overwhelming, a thick, oppressive force that threatened to consume me entirely. But the hiker's words were a lifeline, a thread of hope in the dark. I dug my fingers into the ground, at least I thought I did. It was hard to tell what was real anymore. But the sensation of earth beneath my hands, of something solid and tangible, helped anchor me. I wasn't gone yet. I wasn't lost. Not yet. With every ounce of strength I had left, I focused on the hiker's voice, trying to pull myself back toward the light. The figure roared in my mind, furious, its whispers turning to screeches of rage. I could feel it trying to tear me apart, to drag me down into the void forever. But I wouldn't let it, not without a fight. I pushed back, forcing the figure's presence away from me, clawing my way back to the surface. The hiker's voice grew louder, clearer, the words of the ritual ringing in the air. I could feel the forest around us, the ancient power of the trees vibrating in the ground beneath me. And then, all at once, the darkness shattered. I gasped, the air rushing back into my lungs as the world snapped back into focus. The clearing was still there, the twisted trees looming on all sides. But the figure, it was different now. Its form flickered, unstable, like a shadow caught between worlds. The hiker stood beside me, his hands raised, the journal glowing with an otherworldly light. His voice was strong, unwavering, as he chanted the final words of the ritual. The air around us crackled with energy, the ground trembling beneath our feet. The figure screamed. A high-pitched, unnatural sound that pierced the air like nails on glass. Its form contorted, stretching and warping as the ritual took hold. I watched, my heart racing, as the figure began to dissolve, its shadowy body unraveling like smoke in the wind. It was fighting, clawing at the air, but it was too late. The hiker's words were too strong, the ritual too powerful. The figure let out one final, agonized scream before it was ripped apart, its body disintegrating into nothingness. And then, just like that, it was gone. The clearing was silent. The trees around us stood still, their twisted branches no longer reaching for us, no longer filled with malevolence. The air was lighter, clearer, like the forest had finally exhaled after holding its breath for centuries. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. I could still feel the echoes of the figure's presence, the cold touch of its whispers lingering in the back of my mind. But it was over. It was finally over. The hiker knelt beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. He didn't say anything at first, just sat with me in the stillness of the clearing, both of us catching our breath. "You did it," he said after a long moment, his voice soft but filled with relief. "It's gone." I looked up at him, my body trembling from exhaustion. "What about the forest?" He glanced around, his eyes scanning the trees. "It'll always be here," he said quietly. "But its power is broken. Without the figure, it won't be able to claim anyone else. Not like it did before." I wanted to believe him. But even now, as I sat in the clearing, I could still feel the faintest whisper in the back of my mind. It wasn't like before, no hunger, no malice. Just a quiet, distant hum. Like the forest was watching, waiting. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The hiker stood, offering me his hand. "We leave," he said simply. "And we don't come back." I took his hand, letting him pull me to my feet. My legs felt weak, unsteady, but I forced myself to stand. The hiker was right. It was time to go. Time to leave this cursed place behind. We walked in silence, the weight of the ordeal hanging between us like a heavy fog. The trees around us felt different now, not as menacing, but still ancient, still filled with secrets. The path ahead was clearer, the forest no longer twisting and turning to trap us. But as we reached the edge of the forest, just as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I hesitated. I turned back, looking one last time at the woods that had nearly taken everything from me. The hiker watched me, his expression unreadable. "You ready?" I nodded, though a part of me would never truly be ready. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm ready." And with that, we stepped out of the forest and into the light. But even as we left the woods behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of the forest had come with me. The faint whisper in the back of my mind, the echo of something ancient and unknowable, still lingered. I was free. But I would never be the same. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 8. The sunlight felt foreign on my skin as we emerged from the forest. It was warm, gentle, everything the forest hadn't been. But even in the brightness of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whisper was still there, barely audible but persistent, like the remnants of a dream that refused to fade. The hiker looked at me, his eyes shadowed with a wariness I hadn't noticed before. "You'll hear it for a while," he said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "The forest leaves its mark on everyone who walks too deep." I didn't ask how he knew. I just nodded, keeping my eyes on the ground. We walked for a while in silence, the sounds of the normal world slowly creeping back in, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant hum of a road. But every step felt heavier, as if I were dragging a part of the forest with me. The trailhead came into view, a small, unremarkable sign marking the end of the path. My car was still there, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I felt worlds away from the person who had parked it there, ready for a simple hike. I glanced at the hiker. He hadn't said much since the clearing. His face was drawn, eyes distant, like he was carrying a weight far heavier than mine. The journal was tucked back into his pack, but its presence seemed to linger in the air around him. "What now?" I asked, breaking the silence. My voice sounded foreign to me, like someone else's. The hiker shrugged, though the motion felt forced. You go home, he said, his voice flat. Live your life. I studied him, searching his face for something, comfort, assurance, anything to make this nightmare feel like it had truly ended. But there was nothing. Just that same distant look, like he was already somewhere else. And you? I asked. What do you do? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back at the forest, his eyes narrowing as if he could still see something lurking in the shadows. I keep walking, he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. There's always another forest. Always another place. I felt a chill at his words. Is that what you do? You fight these things? He met my gaze then, his expression hard. Someone has to. The forest may be quiet for now, but there are others like it. Places where the darkness is old and hungry. And people, like you, who wander too close. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just some stranger who had stumbled into my nightmare. He was part of it, part of something much bigger, much darker. So, this isn't over, is it? I asked, dread curling in my chest. For you, it is, he said firmly. The figure's gone. The forest won't come for you again. But for others. The hiker's silence was answer enough. He gave me a tight, grim smile, then turned and started walking down the road, away from the trailhead, away from the forest. He moved with a purpose, like someone who knew the darkness was always just a step behind. I stood there for a long moment, watching him until he disappeared around a bend in the road. I wanted to call after him, to ask more questions, to demand answers. But I knew I wouldn't get them. Whatever battle he was fighting, it wasn't one I could understand. I got into my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, the sound startling in the quiet. I stared at the road ahead, my mind still spinning. As I drove away, the trees lining the highway loomed overhead, their branches casting long shadows over the asphalt. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye made my heart jump. I kept telling myself it was over, that the figure was gone. But no matter how far I drove, that faint whisper in the back of my mind refused to disappear. Weeks passed. Life began to return to some semblance of normal, though the edges of it felt frayed, as if I were living in a slightly different world than before. I went back to work, saw friends, tried to move on. But I never went hiking again. The thought of stepping into the woods, of being surrounded by trees, made my skin crawl. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, I found myself back in the forest. Not the same forest, but forests that were twisted wrong. Trees that stretched unnaturally high into the sky, their branches gnarled like claws. Shadows moved just out of sight, and the whispers, the whispers were always there. Come back. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how many times I told myself it was just a dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with me. That somewhere deep in the woods, something was waiting, watching. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the remnants of another nightmare clinging to me. But the footsteps were too real, too close. I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat, and listened. They were slow, deliberate. Crunching leaves? Someone, or something, was outside. I moved quietly, slipping out of bed and creeping toward the window. My heart raced, each step sending a fresh wave of dread through my body. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was out there. But something pulled me forward, the same pull that had led me into the forest that day. I reached the window and slowly, carefully, pulled the curtain back. The street was empty. No one was there. But the footsteps continued, circling my house, growing louder, closer. My breath caught, and I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, just outside the front door, I heard it. A whisper, soft, but unmistakable. Mine. I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 9. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense, my skin prickling with cold sweat. The whisper had come from inside the house. That word, mine, echoed in my mind, reverberating through the air like a living thing, slithering into every shadow. every dark corner of the room. The footsteps outside had stopped, leaving the world in a dead silence that felt louder than any noise. I strained to hear something, anything, but the house was still, eerily so. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear my own shallow breaths, each one like a countdown to something I couldn't see but could feel, waiting, watching. I had to move. I had to get out. My feet carried me quietly down the hall, my eyes scanning every inch of the house as I passed. Shadows clung to the walls, more menacing than they had ever been before. I reached the living room and grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy metal candle holder, holding it tight in my hand like a makeshift weapon. I didn't know what I was going to face, but I couldn't just stand there, waiting for it to find me first. The front door loomed ahead, a narrow escape into the cool night air. I moved slowly, carefully, my eyes never leaving the dark corners of the room. My hand reached out for the doorknob. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound behind me, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My skin prickled, and I turned, candle holder raised, ready to defend myself against whatever had come into my home. But the room was empty. There was nothing there, just the dim glow of the moonlight filtering in through the windows, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I could feel it, though. Something was wrong. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in on me. And that dragging sound, it wasn't gone. It was closer. I turned back toward the door, my breath caught in my throat. The knob turned on its own. Slowly, deliberately, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but the empty street outside. My grip tightened on the candle holder, every instinct telling me to run, to leave this house, this town, this nightmare behind. But something stopped me, a whisper. "Come." It was faint, but it was there, curling around me like a cold breeze. It was coming from outside. I could feel the pull, the same irresistible force that had drawn me into the forest that day. And I knew, deep down, that if I stepped out into that darkness, I wouldn't come back. Not the same. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering in my chest. My pulse thudded in my ears as I backed away, retreating deeper into the house. But the whisper followed me. "Come." It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, something that filled the house, the air, my lungs. I could feel it wrapping around me, tugging at my mind, pulling me back toward the door, toward whatever waited for me in the night. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing the first number that came to mind. The hiker. The phone rang once, twice. "Pick up," I whispered, my voice trembling. On the third ring he answered. "Are you okay?" His voice was sharp, alert, like he had been expecting my call. "No," I breathed. "It's happening again. It's in my house." There was a pause on the other end. Then the hiker's voice came through, calm but urgent. "Don't go outside. Whatever you do, don't open the door." I didn't, I said, my eyes darting toward the front door, now eerily still. "But it's here. I can feel it. I think it's the forest. It's trying to take me back." There was another pause, longer this time. "It's not the forest," he said slowly. "It's the figure." My blood ran cold. "But you said the figure was gone. You said—" "I was wrong," he interrupted, his voice grim. "The figure isn't part of the forest. It's older than that, stronger, and once it marks you, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." I felt the room spin around me. "Then how do I stop it?" "You can't," he said quietly. "Not completely. The best you can do is keep it at bay. But the figure, it's not just in the woods. It's everywhere. Once it's inside you, it's always there." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the figure's presence now, stronger than ever, pressing in from all sides. I wasn't safe, not here, not anywhere. "What do I do?" I whispered, my voice barely holding together. There was a long pause. Then, the hiker's voice came through, steady but full of weight. "You need to find the place it's strongest, the place where you first encountered it. That's where it's tied to you." "The clearing," I whispered. "Yes, if you want to stop it, you have to go back. But you won't be alone this time." A flicker of hope sparked in my chest. "You'll come with me." "I'll meet you there," he said, "but you'd have to hurry." The longer you wait, the stronger it gets. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what he had just said. Go back? After everything that had happened, my whole body screamed against it. But what choice did I have? The whisper was growing louder now, more insistent. Come. I grabbed my keys and jacket, adrenaline pushing me out of the house. As I locked the door behind me, the quiet street stretched out ahead, a path back to the place I had sworn I would never return. I got in my car and drove, the road ahead swallowed by darkness. The trees on either side loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and black against the night sky. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, sent a jolt of terror through me. But I couldn't stop now. I was already marked. And it was waiting. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides, but eventually, I saw it, the trailhead. It looked different now, almost smaller, more insignificant in the glow of my headlights. But I knew what waited beyond the trees. I parked the car and stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin. My breath formed clouds in the air as I made my way toward the path. The forest loomed ahead, an impenetrable wall of shadows. I hesitated for a moment at the entrance, the weight of the figure's presence heavy in the air. But then I heard it again, that soft whisper, more urgent now. Come. And so I went. The Hiker in the Woods, Part 10. The forest swallowed me whole as soon as I stepped onto the path. The night was thick, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. My flashlight cast narrow beams through the trees, barely penetrating the shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. The path twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like the woods were shifting, reshaping themselves to keep me trapped. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. The further I went, the more the world around me seemed to blur. The trees became indistinct shapes, melting into the shadows. The ground beneath my feet felt soft, almost like I was walking on something that wasn't earth. And that voice, it was everywhere now, filling the air, the trees, the ground beneath me. Almost there. My breathing was shallow, my heart hammering in my chest as I stumbled through the dark. The flashlight flickered, the batteries dying, and for a moment I was plunged into complete blackness. Panic surged through me, but then the light returned, dimmer now, barely illuminating the trail ahead. I don't know how long I walked, minutes, hours. Time seemed to lose meaning in the endless night. But eventually, I saw it. The clearing. It opened up ahead of me, the trees pulling back like a curtain to reveal the same twisted, unnatural space where everything had begun. My breath caught in my throat. The clearing looked exactly the same, dark, suffocating, the air thick with the same oppressive energy I had felt before. But something was different this time. The figure was waiting. It stood in the center of the clearing, its form still shadowy, still indistinct, but there was no mistaking it. The same cold, predatory presence that had haunted me from the moment I first stepped into these woods. Its head turned toward me as I entered the clearing, and I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. My legs felt like they were moving through water as I stepped forward, drawn toward it despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. I could feel its pull, stronger now, more insistent, as if the very air around me was pushing me toward it. Mine. The word echoed in my mind, louder than ever, filling every corner of my thoughts. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything but that one, singular command. I was so close now. Just a few more steps. Suddenly, there was a hand on my arm, yanking me back. The hiker. He appeared out of the shadows, his grip strong, pulling me away from the figure. Don't, he hissed, his voice low but fierce. Don't listen to it. I blinked, the fog in my mind clearing just enough to realize how close I had been to stepping right into the figure's reach. I stumbled back, the hiker's grip steadying me as the figure let out a low, guttural sound, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. You're stronger than it, the hiker said, his eyes locked on the figure. It feeds on fear. On doubt. Don't give it what it wants. The figure shifted, its form flickering, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. But I could feel its rage, its hunger, pressing down on us like a tangible force. The whisper came again, more forceful this time. pushing against my thoughts, trying to claw its way back into my mind. Come. Closer. The hiker tightened his grip on my arm, his voice steady. We're going to end this. But you need to trust me. I nodded, though every fiber of my being was screaming in terror. I had no choice. The figure wasn't going to stop until it had me. The hiker pulled the journal from his pack, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. The same strange symbols I had seen before glowed faintly in the dim light, and as he began to chant, the air around us seemed to shift. The clearing grew colder, the shadows deepening as if the very forest were recoiling from the power of the words. The figure let out a low growl, its form becoming more distorted, more chaotic. It began to move toward us, slow at first, then faster, its shadowy limbs stretching out, reaching for me. But the hiker didn't stop. His voice grew louder, more forceful, the words reverberating through the air like a drumbeat. The symbols in the journal flared brighter, casting an eerie light across the clearing. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently, as if it were being torn apart. "You can't have me," I shouted, my voice breaking through the fog of fear. "I'm not yours." The figure screeched, a sound that pierced the air like shards of glass. It lunged toward me, but the hiker's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, and the figure was thrown back, its shadowy form unraveling like smoke. The air around us crackled with energy, the ground trembling beneath our feet as the hiker spoke the final words of the ritual. The figure let out one last, ear-splitting shriek before it began to dissolve, its body breaking apart into tendrils of darkness that were sucked into the earth, vanishing into the ground. And then, just like before, the clearing was silent. I stood there, gasping for breath, my whole body trembling. The figure was gone. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving behind only the quiet hum of the forest. The hiker lowered the journal, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "It's over," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, my mind still reeling. "For good this time." He nodded, though there was a shadow in his eyes. "It won't come for you again. The figure's gone. But the forest." He trailed off, glancing at the trees that surrounded us. "It's still watching. It always is." I followed his gaze, the twisted branches of the trees casting long, dark shadows across the clearing. The figure might be gone, but the forest, its ancient, unknowable power, still lingered. We stood there for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. I was free. But something in me had changed. I could feel it, deep down, a part of me still tethered to this place, to the darkness I had faced. The hiker turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You should leave," he said quietly. "Don't come back, not to this forest, not to any forest." I nodded, knowing he was right. I had been marked once, and though the figure was gone, the forest would always remember. As I walked back down the trail, the hiker's words echoed in my mind. The forest is always watching. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, I knew something, some part of the darkness, was still waiting. Waiting for the next soul to wander too close.